We're going to talk about accessibility and digital strategy and acknowledge first off that this conversation usually happens at different scales. Not every organization can go from just talking about accessibility to an organization-wide effort. And that's one of the goals that I have in talking about this with you all today is to make that be okay. But at the same time, talk a little bit about what it means. There are some practical implications if the scale of your effort is really limited to, say, a project team, as an example. So we'll go back, if you can, or if you want to think back to pre-pandemic, there was a time when technology wasn't, well, everywhere, right? Well, I think we're in a place where during March of 2020, technology just was everywhere. We digitized all the things, every interaction. It didn't matter if you were a student in school, an employee, almost everyone had a pretty significant shift in how they interacted with the world. Even if they were having to go into work, even social interactions were suddenly out to Zoom or other platforms. So what we've got on screen is a picture of a woman with headphones in front of her laptop, which for a lot of people is now the office. So much has changed. And I think Zoom, Teams, similar platforms to those are really relatable examples. You're in front of Zoom right now with this event, right? And after this amount of time, we really started to clue in, I think, better on what works. We've started to think more strategically in general about the things that we're putting out there, the ways that we're interacting with our different audiences through technology. Because again, at least in my experience, there's more technology now than there ever has been. And so I think that there are also a lot of opportunities. This also presents some challenges when it comes to accessibility. I think that while this topic of accessibility has been amplified, it's had a little bit more interest since the pandemic because of this mass digitization, there are definitely some hands up saying, what about accessibility? And that's often a question that happens late in a project. If you were in the last session that Sherry Byrne-Haber did, she talked about shifting accessibility left in projects and gave a lot of really great insight into doing that. If you want a deep dive, go check out the recording because that was a really, really valuable session in looking at that project level view. We also do have more design and development teams asking a parallel kind of question, but at a little bit different scale, saying, well, why aren't we further along? You know, maybe the design or development or quality assurance teams have been thinking about accessibility, but they've started to recognize that there aren't so many other spots within the organization that have really embraced it the way that maybe they have. One of the things that I've observed, and this goes back to before the pandemic, but I think maybe even more so now, we see that technology decisions aren't made on an island. It's very rare for one unit, one department to decide, I'm going to go buy this enterprise level tool. I'm not going to say it doesn't happen. Some of you might disagree with my assertion that that's rare. I would say, though, that it has become more common for these decisions to really involve a lot of groups within an organization. And I think that this piece, which is not specific to accessibility, is still really central. It's foundational to looking at accessibility as a part of our digital strategies more broadly, because of the interrelatedness and the interactions that different groups have to either create or deploy or purchase different kinds of technology. So this is a brief case study of sorts. It's really more of a composite of different organizations, but I have a couple of goals in going through this. One is to illustrate that accessibility does go across multiple units and that we do need to have an appropriate level of accessibility awareness within different groups in an organization. And we'll get to the point, which is ultimately that we've got to have our leadership really looking at this much more broadly. If you're a little bit further along, if this is a conversation that you've been having, I'm hopeful that maybe this thought process will help to extend the conversation a little bit within your organization. Maybe you've thought about some of the things I'll mention, but you're thinking about, well, how do we broaden this out? How do we demonstrate some of these things locally? And I'm hopeful, again, if you're more mature in your conversation about accessibility, that this will still be beneficial. So the group that I want to look at within an organization is human relations as an example. And I'm going to talk through again, kind of this composite view based on a lot of experience in working with different agencies and private sector firms to talk about some of this interactivity. So why HR? It's not necessarily a tech shop. You don't necessarily think up front, but in a lot of organizations, human relations does a significant amount with technology. They often influence the selection of very large platforms. They are often influenced by other folks, right? And they also, I think, critically provide platforms that serve an internal audience and that also aim to an external audience through public websites. If HR isn't a good fit, I hope you can generalize this to another group within your organization and maybe still get some of the benefit of thinking through this to help to either understand and or maybe justify looking at accessibility at a larger scale. So if we think about one particular product that is relatively common in a lot of organizations, that's an employee management system. If it's a large system, these are typically purchased, and a lot of them are modular enough that you don't have to purchase all the bells and whistles. So we use this as kind of our central focus. This can also include things that are uploaded into an employment management system. You might have PDF forms, which a lot of people don't want to talk about PDF. It's a big part of the technology and therefore the accessibility conversation that I think we kind of have to continue to discuss and be realistic about. And in this conversation, the human relations group will also play a few different roles. So let's start by talking about some of the different roles that an HR unit might actually have. One is as a product owner. If we're thinking about this large or medium-sized employment management system, then HR is going to be the group that drives a lot of the requirements, right? They're going to be the ones who say, this is what we need this thing to do. They'll probably have some that are non-negotiable that it must do. There will be some that are somewhat of a preference, but still really important. And there might be some things that are nice to have. Well, think about whether or not accessibility is part of that conversation. As a product owner, there's a tremendous opportunity to at least be able to pull accessibility into that set of requirements. So there's a lot of potential, right? We'll talk about how that potential might not really be reachable, but there's still potential. There can be things like third-party integration. There can be things like a need to either tie in or directly host benefits management. And I'll say again, hello to accessibility, and then possibly bye-bye to accessibility, because if HR as a product owner or anyone else who is a product owner within an organization doesn't have other groups, doesn't have other people who influence these decisions, also folding accessibility into the thought process, it can pretty much just be kicked out and completely removed from the conversation. So it's really critical when you think about any product owner to think about who is leading to these decisions in addition to that particular group or individual who has a lot of influence in the space. And we'll talk about some potential candidates here in a few minutes. HR can also, and often does, serve the role of content creator. They could be creating those fillable forms that are uploaded into the platform. They might be adding content directly into the employment management system and need to know some of the nuts and bolts about accessibility, which is something that within the HR group, they may be able to tackle to some degree. They might be able to find some information online, get some training set up. However, if that external scaffolding isn't in place, if the influences around the rest of the organization aren't contributing to an overall goal of more accessibility in the digital space, then they're still going to face a much lower ceiling. So let's talk about this influencing part, because I think this is really important. And I think this is what will illustrate that if we're going to tackle accessibility, even as a long-term goal, we need to think about it as an organization-wide effort. So possible influencers, there could definitely be more, but they may start with information technology. The information technology group is likely to be involved, especially with something like an HRMS, a human relations management system platform. If you have that offered as software as a service, then they're likely to come in with some policy and governance. Same with information security. If you're holding on to employee information, that's typically very sensitive data, and you're going to have some guardrails about what you can and can't do, and they're likely to be very involved in these kinds of conversations. For example, Don't ask for social security numbers on PDFs. More than likely, your information security team isn't going to be a big fan. You're also likely to have your procurement office, your purchasing group, whoever that might be, involved with their own set of processes and governance they might require for a big enough purchase over a certain dollar amount that you have to get a certain number of bids. There are things like that that they'll bring into the conversation as well. Your marketing and brand strategy group may have something to do with this, because as you're rolling out this platform, while it may not match your website exactly in terms of look and feel, you're probably going to need to have your brand identity in that particular piece of software. So you think about logos, you think about your color scheme, maybe there's a style guide that can help those people who are authoring content to know how to stay on brand. So with each one of these influencers, we have opportunities. Again, let's say that IT is helping to drive accessibility forward, and they, maybe in conjunction with your purchasing and procurement folks, build a more robust environment to really set everyone up across the organization to properly vet accessibility in candidate products, maybe even looking at products that you already have deployed throughout the organization. If your marketing crew is already accounting for accessibility with your brand identity, with your color scheme, then in that style guide, you may well have guidance about colors that you can use together and stay on brand, and also conform to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines about color contrasts. When, however, those groups aren't on board, let's go back to the situation I mentioned a few minutes ago, where it's really HR, the product owner, who's keeping accessibility in the conversation. It's going to be tricky, because now you have, 3 groups, potentially more, that aren't necessarily advocating against accessibility. They're just not keeping it in the front of mind in the conversation. It's not being weighed as heavily when accounting for a decision, or when accounting for different variables that would contribute to making a decision. So it's really, really key that with all of these different influences, number one, that we acknowledge that they're there. There can be within organizations a little bit of friction between some of these groups, because they don't want that influence. Maybe over the course of the pandemic, there's been a shift in your organization away from having more siloed decision making about technology to it indeed being more comprehensively viewed by the organization. Well, that can cause some static from time to time. But I do think that it's just a reality. And I think then it's an opportunity. I think it means that we can position ourselves as organizations to not just have a product owner. Well, shoot, for a lot of organizations, it's an individual who's trying to advocate for accessibility, or it's a small team who's trying to do that for the entire organization. So in order to, I guess, kind of deal with this reality, I think one of the things that we need to do is indeed look at accessibility as a program that is scalable across the organization, that is sustained over time, that doesn't rely on one person who eventually gets burned out and leaves, and that's durable, that doesn't, when that one person leaves, just fall apart. We want to build something that will stand the test of time. And this is, I think, a place where we can acknowledge many of you sitting there going, okay, that sounds great. But how can I do that as one person? We'll talk about some tips, but I think it's really helpful to acknowledge that this can be a very, very long bridge to get across for an organization, and that there are some ways to think on a little bit smaller scale about accessibility as a strategy. I think that there's a reality that comes with that, though, which is that the ceiling for that work is going to be lower. And we'll discuss that more specifically in a few different contexts here as we go forward. So something that might be a little bit closer for you to get a hold of is looking at accessibility in project strategy. Again, Sherry Byrne-Haber's talk about this was fantastic. Catch it in the archive if you can, because she really does drill down into a lot more detail than I'm going to be able to cover. But taking a look at working accessibility testing into what you're doing as you not only build, but as you design things, not waiting to test stuff until we're 2 weeks out from the release, right? I think for practical reasons, most of us get intellectually that that's not a great model. A lot of organizations still rely on that model. You want to be sure that as you're doing this testing, you're putting all of your accessibility bugs in the same backlog as your other bugs, right? A lot of this comes down to, as an organization, looking at accessibility as just part of what we need to do. It is a business requirement, which again, I think that's another indicator that we need to look at this at a larger scale. And for those of you who did watch Sherry's talk, I promise you that I did not change a single slide. Anything that repeats what she said is coincidental and personally affirming for me, but I didn't make any changes because she talked about making sure that barriers are cataloged in your backlog and that they're not tracked in some separate spreadsheet that eventually people stop looking at. So that means that project managers have a lot of potential in this conversation. On some levels, on many levels, they can help to lead the shifting left. They can help to lead project teams to be able to build accessibility into the design process, to work it as far upstream as possible. Now, possible is going to vary. This might be a very incremental sort of thing, which again, I think is okay. It's going to be, for some organizations, a very big shift that might take a long time. But project managers are in a pretty good position often to be able to do that. They can also help to manage timelines. If you have a team that needs some professional development, project manager recognizes that, maybe they can advocate for that professional development and then give people time to actually be able to take what they've learned and put it into action. I've worked in a few different training settings, and I've found that a few organizations will call and ask for the same training multiple times for the same audience. And I think there are some questions that you can start to ask about whether or not that training audience is being given the time by project managers, product managers, and on and on up to be able to take what they learn and actually put it into action, right? Practice it so that it's really a skill. Project managers may be able to communicate these skills and other resource gaps to product managers and other leadership, help to make it part of the definition of done, unless and until they can't. And this is where things start to scale just within an organization, maybe even within an IT group within an organization. Because if the product management isn't on board, then it's very much the same situation as when you have these outside influencers in a platform use decision, right? It's a really, really similar conversation. So let's say project managers are struggling. They are maybe having success on their own project teams, but they're finding that the project's timelines aren't changing. They go back to product and they say, hey, we need just a little bit more time. We're trying to build a more accessible whatever it is. And we know we can do it. We just need a bit of time. We need whatever resource. We need a bit of training or reinforcement. Well, if product isn't behind it, then again, that ceiling is much, much lower. And if you're looking at success across the product, that gets tricky. Especially in project teams, if you have a product vertical and you have 6 or 7 project teams and only one is really trying to take accessibility on, they start to get stretched very thin. I've talked to groups and organizations over the years who say that we're in a situation where we as a team are doing well with accessibility. And now on top of being expected to do the same work in the same time that we have been all along, we're also being leaned on as the resident accessibility experts. So that contributes, again, to burnout. That contributes to people not being as engaged in the work and finding that they're getting stretched really thin while still having their baseline of responsibilities on their plates. So let's scale it up a little bit, talk a bit about the product management level. Product managers, whether that's their role or not, as far as their role on paper, are there to help to keep a long-term vision for the product in place. Well, this is a great place then, right? To have a product manager who is really embracing accessibility, who's making sure that they are running some interference for their project teams, therefore allowing the project managers to add a little bit of extra slack into a timeline if they need to, bring on some training, maybe not just for one project team, but for all of the project teams who are in that vertical. Things like inclusive personas that tend to not just be project based, but that do tend to be at the product level, maybe even higher. Ideally, if you are a design or development shop, and even if you're doing design and development work internally, something like personas are going to be there to benefit everybody and help keep everybody focused on the diverse needs of the human beings that we're sending our technology out to. product managers may be in a better position to advance this conversation with leadership as well, simply because of where they are in the organization. But then we have a very similar kind of question. What about different product verticals? If we have 5 or 6 product verticals and we have however many project teams under each one, we might just repeat the project situation that I described at a larger scale, where the people who are doing the work on one product vertical are just nailing accessibility, but no one else is really doing it. So you can just kind of scale up the challenges. You can scale up the fact that now this product team is the de facto group of accessibility experts. You can scale up the fact that even though they're doing really well with their product, if you have multiple products that you're offering, those may still not really have much attention focused on accessibility. And then we can talk as well about purchasing itself. We talked about purchasing specific to that human relations example, but we really don't want to spend money on inaccessible stuff. There's no reason to spend money on things that discriminate against people with disabilities. It's important in the conversation about purchasing and procurement that it's not just about stuff you buy. The free plugins that you put into your website need some levels of accessibility vetting, just the same way your really large platforms that you're going to purchase do. And so it's very important when you're thinking about procurement, somewhat in isolation, that you recognize that accessibility needs to be folded into those conversations the way that I did illustrate with the human relations example. And I think that procurement is even more important now maybe than it was, 5 years ago, but especially since the pandemic. I noticed, and I can't back this up with data, but I noticed that there were a lot more organizations buying things as opposed to building them. And this was a trend that I think goes back a ways in a number of different parts of the economy. And then when the pandemic hit, we were buying or using a whole bunch of stuff. We didn't have time to build something up. So there was a lot of purchasing and using of third-party things going on. And what we need to look for with procurement is making sure that through every step, we are including accessibility as much as we can from the very beginning, from a request for information, a request for proposal, make sure that we're not only adding that into document and boilerplate language, but that we're highlighting, that we're talking about this as something that we need to focus attention on. We're bringing it up to the vendors that we're working with or potentially working with, and just emphasizing that, look, this is something we as an organization value. And so you're going to hear a lot about it from us. So please do take it seriously. Well, if you're looking at a situation where you've had a product in place for a while, this isn't a new product that you're trying to make a decision about, but it's a vendor partner you've been working with for a while, then you've got to figure out strategically, how do we bring accessibility into the conversation with them? Oftentimes, a contract will have a periodic renewal. That can be a good time to bring it up, ideally in advance of that, just to give them a heads up that, hey, going into this next contract cycle, we're going to want to talk about accessibility in the platform. And I have seen a lot of times where with some of these other areas I've talked about, it's a test of organizational will, but with procurement, because procurement reaches across so many parts of an organization, I think this one is a really good indicator of the organizational will. And what I mean by that is, does the organization have the drive to say, we're not going to buy that product because it is not nearly as accessible, or it's not as accessible as this other one? Does the organization have the will to bring this up in a conversation with a current vendor partner and say, look, we need to know what you're doing about accessibility. We need to know timelines, because we need to determine whether or not we're going to continue what might be a longstanding relationship with that vendor partner. You will also hear Corb O'Connor talk about procurement more tomorrow. So if you're interested in this angle of this conversation, then by all means, jump onto his talk as well. So I hope that I've at least built a case to say, look, this is something that does deserve a bigger picture view. And when you start talking about organizational will, right, when you start thinking about these really big decisions and even the small decisions, how do we make sure that someone who is not subject to our purchasing governance, our purchasing policies, who maybe has a company credit card and under a certain dollar amount, they can buy something, how do we make sure that if we can't directly govern that, right? If we can't manage it to that low of a level, how can we try as hard as we can to make that individual at least think about accessibility and at least consider accessibility and know who to reach out to in the organization before they make that relatively small purchase, which in this day and time, you don't have to spend a lot of money to buy something that impacts a huge number of human beings that work with us, that work for us. So this needs to be built into organizational strategy. And there are a number of things that need to happen. Again, you may not be able to start here, but as a longer term goal, we need to think about how can we build this into our overall digital strategy to bring, again, that sustainability, take away the brittle nature of what is often something that is more siloed. So there are some keys. We've seen these at WebAIM with some previous grant work as well. If you start to look at maturity models for accessibility across organizations, I think a lot of us have noticed a lot of the same indicators, a lot of the same things that tell us that an organization may be really embracing accessibility this broadly. One of the keys is to have active leadership and stakeholders involved in driving these conversations. Your list of stakeholders, if you think about everybody who's impacted by this conversation, it's likely to be a pretty big list. In most organizations, a whole lot of people contribute to digital. And I don't think anybody would suggest that you include everyone as a stakeholder, but you're going to have stakeholders that will be absolutely integral for you to be able to scale this up from one vertical, maybe just adjacent to another or to others, or to scale it up from that project level to product and so on and so on. And I think there's a really big difference between having leadership that supports you and that says, yes, you go do that, that's fantastic, and leadership that is actively leading on this as well, taking this into meetings and advocating for accessibility at that C-suite high level. Because really that's when you see that organizational will start to change. Most organizations need, well, every organization is going to need a level of planning, a level of policy, overall some governance around accessibility. And you can tie a lot of this into a lot of your possibly existing structure for things like information security. I think it's really important, though, to keep in mind that information security, if you consider who might be impacted by it or who might contribute to it, it tends to be at least a little bit shorter list than accessibility. Now, information security folks are cringing and they're putting things into the chat, probably telling me that's ridiculous. But what I have observed is that there are a lot more people that directly influence accessibility within an organization at that decision-making and content creation level. So the governance, the guidance, and the planning. The planning is such a huge component of this. Any of you who have taken a few paces down this road, this trail to building an accessibility program, you know that the planning is really, really key. Well, that's why having a set of stakeholders who are directly involved, maybe you have kind of an orbiting set of stakeholders that's more broad, that is taking a look at the work that smaller group is doing and taking a look at things like policy suggestions. Maybe you do want or need a policy that specifically states, we're doing accessibility now, and here's how in your planning. Again, these kinds of things really do rely on having leadership actively lead on it. You can make all of the policy recommendations you want to as a task force, but if you make recommendations and no one does anything, then you're not much further ahead. One of the other big indicators that we've seen is an investment. At some point, organizations do need to invest in building this accessibility program out. At the very least, you're going to need to invest the humans that work for you by helping them to build schools, by helping them to build schools, to build skills, and by helping them to just learn what this context and the paradigm about accessibility on the web really means. And you may also very well need to invest in some tools. Most people, when they think of tools, they think of accessibility testing tools, which, yes, are a very important part of the conversation. But it might not just be at that testing and quality assurance level. It may be investing in some plugins and such that you might put into your UX design. It may be an investment in learning how to use tools that are freely available, but often misused in the procurement conversation. There are a lot of really great tools out there, but a lot of organizations just don't know how to use them. It's not even the proverbial when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail situation. It's that no one's taught you how to actually use one of these tools that can help to contribute to your advancing accessibility in a particular space. And then the other thing that I think is really critical is making sure that you're measuring progress. So at that nuts and bolts level, yes, but also taking a look at progress as where are we moving ahead within the organizations? What are some things that we can observe and bring into a model, a matrix that would show us we are moving the needle forward on this? For example, do you have accessibility written into relevant job descriptions? And that's not just your web team, that's not just your IT. If you have design and developer, designers and developers, that's people that use Microsoft Office to publish stuff to the corporate intranet, right? In an academic setting, that's knowing how to use different tools to create content, whether you're doing open educational resource work, which in education space is, I think, relatively well known, but making sure that people know how to use something like Microsoft Office, Microsoft PowerPoint. If you're delivering PowerPoint presentations, can you make them so that they're accessible? And then what kind of measures can you pull in to be able to account for success? With the professional development piece, is it enough? Are we comfortable saying we have trained X, Y, Z number of people? Or do we want to look at some assessment? Do we want to be sure that people are actually learning? And what does that assessment look like? What can we invest in it? There are a lot of things that are really key in helping to steer your measurement with some of these things that upfront don't seem as easy to quantify. But there are quite a number of things out there that will indeed help to measure. So the biggest thing that I see organizations do, and I've been in conversations before with leadership where I had a very specific conversation about the different technology tools that each leader's individual area contributes to. And we talked about some of the interconnectedness and the way that one group might influence another. But what we ended up doing, I think, was just scaring everybody, right? Because this is a big conversation in a lot of organizations. There's just a lot of technology, and it can be very, very intimidating. I think that the biggest thing to do is get started. If it's starting small, some brown bag lunches at the project team level, whatever level your conversation currently exists at, start to nudge a little bit there, start to bring more people into that fold. There are employee resource group models out there that are working very, very well, especially when it comes to getting leadership where they're comfortable embracing this topic and indeed leading on and carrying it again into their board meetings or leadership meetings that they might have. There are a number of places to start. The biggest thing is, in my experience at least, just start, right? Start with something. And invite somebody in to do a quick brown bag, like I said, about a specific topic that maybe is directly applicable to your group, but maybe it nudges them a little bit. Maybe it's just disability awareness, making sure that your crew, who's not only doing the technology work, but who's also in leadership, knows and understands more about how people with disabilities actually use technology, actually engage with the web. But most importantly, just start where you can. So a quick recap, and then I'm going to put a couple of things into the chat and move over to questions. I think that, and I hope that that brief exercise we did, thinking through the interaction between different units, can help to show that we really do need to look at accessibility as a program. That you can, in the spirit of progress over perfection, which I did lift that from Sherry's talk. She mentioned that phrase. You can start small and smaller, just as long as you anticipate that your reach might not be what you want it to be, that you may well hit some of those ceilings sooner than you might expect even, but that you can get started on a smaller scale. Things like product procurement may be a little bit more in reach and might be good ways to illustrate to leadership when you begin to see where looking at the project level doesn't really work. You can point to those ceilings more directly and specifically within your organization. And then, of course, when you're looking organization-wide, that's where things really take off, right? That's where things can really come in and start to work for the organization. So I'm going to actually stop sharing. I'm going to drop a couple of things in the chat. I'll jump onto some questions as well, because there are a couple out there in the Q&A. And the first question is I grab a couple of links. How can we accommodate our third-party vendors hired to do accessibility in the testing process? So these are, Aaron, I guess I'm not sure when you say how can we accommodate the vendors. If you could clarify that, you can actually chat to the host and panelists as well. If you just clarify that question, that would be fantastic. Another question here, do you think part of the issue is that there isn't enough disability representation in those roles, e.g. product managers, project managers, et cetera, which means they aren't considering accessibility due to the fact they don't have lived experience of disability, or at least don't consider themselves as doing so? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's a good point. There aren't, I would say that it's potentially trickier. There aren't people in those roles. And when a design team or a dev team, when a technology team, let's go back to personas as an example. When they think about personas, so personas, for those of you who aren't familiar, technology teams will often have a group of personas that they use, and that kind of serves as the foundation for their understanding of the human beings who will use the thing that they create. So if your personas don't include anybody with a disability, then the ripple of that is actually pretty damaging, right? Because no one's thinking about it. And so I think that there are multiple points where disabled people don't have any representation at all. So I think that is a big part of the challenge. And I think that there are some things before we get to a place where we can change our organization's culture so that they're really trying to be willfully inclusive of people with disabilities in hiring, because that's a whole other talk, and that is another very large fish to fry, if you will, for a lot of organizations. But yes, to answer your question directly, I think that's absolutely one of the big challenges, and I think that there are some steps that organizations can begin to take. Like I mentioned, having people with disabilities as a part of an external user group, right? And integrated. If you're paying people to do any kind of user testing for you, pay people with disabilities to do the user testing. The insight's going to be really, really helpful in a number of ways. It's likely going to be more broad than just, here's how this thing can be more accessible. You're likely to get a ton of insight into user experience, more general user experience issues that the thing actually has. So I hope I answered that question. Yeah, I think there are a lot of points where people with disabilities are not represented in organizations just in general, whether it's decision making, whether it's on the dev team, in the design team. And so that expanded conversation of how do we make sure that we are targeting people with disabilities for positions that we're hiring for? How are we willfully targeting that group of individuals, I think can help quite a lot. Yeah, is there a template for pitching the importance to management? Hard to figure it out from scratch. As with a lot of things, what's going to resonate is going to depend, which is the worst answer in the world. But I can qualify it a little bit. I think it's really helpful to go into it as a conversation a lot of the time and find out what resonates. For some in leadership, the big thing will really just be risk management and compliance. Now, I tend to think that can set the bar a little bit low. It's like an Office Space, which I'm dating myself referencing that movie. I don't know, maybe younger folks like it too, but one of the characters makes a comment that after being yelled at by 6 different bosses for not doing something right, he makes a comment that, look, getting yelled at by 6 different people is only going to make me do enough to not get yelled at. So I think that even when you talk about that compliance mindset, that can work. I have seen it backfire to really lean on compliance. But I think it makes good sense to ask around the organization and try to get a feel for what kind of message resonates. If your organization has any kind of a diversity, equity, and inclusion effort going right now, I think you should absolutely try to tie it into that. There's a lot of conversation I've seen on LinkedIn where people are adding to DE&I, they're adding an A, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. So not an area that is tech-centric, right? It's not something where you would think maybe that, oh, this is a technology thing, and we need to have our DE&I folks in to help us with these technology challenges, but they might be able to fold accessibility more into their work. And in a lot of organizations, they have a pretty good hear from leadership, and they can really help to, again, kind of change that culture. Um, so yeah, it's not, there's not a template that I have seen. At least I wouldn't go so far as to say, here are the steps. I do think that it is a decent learning process just to figure out what's going to fit, what's going to work within our organization. And I was looking to see, I know Aaron had asked, how can we accommodate our third-party vendors hired to do accessibility in the testing process? And so again, Aaron, if you could just clarify in the chat what you're going for there. Another question, you don't have a list of vendors or consultants who do a good job with accessibility, do you? That's been hard for us to identify. On the vendor side, that's tricky to talk about. Like if there's a vendor platform that's really strong, the trickiness is, what if something changes? You do have, I think you do have some exemplars out there who have built really good accessibility programs. You look at a lot of the stuff that's coming out of Microsoft, you look at Adobe, you look at Google. If I'm leaving, if anybody who's out there, if I'm leaving your organization out, put it in the chat, I'll repeat it. But I do think that you have some that are doing a lot of really, really cool work. And I mentioned some of those because it's not just an accessibility conversation that they're having. They're really trying to help with broader inclusion. Microsoft has groups that are working to help employ people with disabilities and to bring more people with disabilities into their workplace, which I think is really, really valuable, right? That goes back to what we were discussing a few minutes ago about how that's one of the big gaps that organizations have. They don't have disabled people in these roles that are so key to building out the technology infrastructure. So I want to drop a couple of things into the chat real quick. If you are on the procurement side and you have interest in learning a little bit more about some of the tools and techniques that I alluded to, we do have a workshop coming up on that. I just dropped it in the chat. Feel free to take a look at that information. The other thing that I wanted to drop in there, I mentioned some work that WebAIM has done in the past about these benchmarks and indicators. And that was actually a grant-funded effort, and it's not in the WebAIM website just yet, but I think I'll put it in here because you can dig into this a fair amount more. And you can really dig into the indicators that I mentioned and just really scratch the surface of and find out more about what's behind the indicators. So the way it's all structured is we've got these indicators, and there are benchmarks that organizations can show where they are making advancement. This work, one of the big things that we're doing now is taking a look at this and making some adjustments to it. I still think it has a ton of value. One thing to keep in mind with this is it was in the context of higher education. However, while higher education is a lot different than a lot of other organizations, there's still a lot in common. So I think this is still a place that you can go to get some good insight and to be able to get more into that granularity with the notion of accessibility as a program. So Ruth says, we've benchmarked similar organizations that have been working on their accessibility initiative for 25 years, our organization for 6+ years now. What is WebAIM's perspective as far as longevity of addressing accessibility in the future? At the organizational level, to me, if you're thinking about it as it is a part, it's a real acted upon part of the mission, right? It's not just put into a mission statement, but it is actually valued by the organization. That sounds maybe a little soft and fluffy, but I think that's where we need to be. I think that's what helps accessibility to remain in a conversation. I do think it'll be interesting to watch some of these larger organizations that are tech-centric and some that aren't, and see how accessibility, whether it's in digital or the built environment, looks in 5-10 years out. But I think that having that true value of accessibility, which comes back to at maybe a more applied level, making sure, again, that leadership is leading on it, they're building it into everything that they possibly can. They are empowering people who work within the organization to do the work and do it well. And a lot of that, again, comes back to engaging with maybe advocacy groups that are in their location that can come in and bring that lived experience to a number of people across the organization. I don't think it's just a a technology group's issue, right? That's why I mentioned HR, which you maybe think about as a technology group within organizations. I think that it has to be a really big umbrella that we put over our organizations. And I think there's a bigger societal kind of impact here. I think that when you talk to a lot of folks in the accessibility space, people with disabilities outside of the context of technology, there's a little bit of concern about the number of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts that don't include people with disabilities. And I do think that there are a lot of inroads being built to address that. But I think that it's not this isn't a technology problem, strictly speaking, right? If it was, we could probably find a technology-based solution. But this is very much people-based. This is very much people, valuing the experiences of a diverse group of people that an organization interacts with virtually. And so I think when you look at it, that becomes super maybe pie in the sky and aspirational. But if we're talking about making it so that it really is just something that an organization does, and it's just almost reflex, that's what we're likely to need to do, is to really help to put an organization in a position where it is reflexive. No one thinks about it. It's built in from the very beginning when someone arrives as an employee. It's their experience throughout the duration of their employment. It does speak to more inclusive hiring practices as well. So I think to really reach that level, we've got some work. But I think that, again, we can get there. I probably just freaked out 200 people who are like, we can't do that in our organization. But I think that we can start to take those steps. And I really do believe that.